Or when you get to a point where you've got a really good base like this guy does, and then you're not so much doing it for your own metrics and your own progress, you're doing it because he's looking around at other people and worrying that they're ahead of him or that he's falling behind. That's when it gets unhealthy, because then you're putting in all this work and effort towards something that you can't necessarily control, which is an external factor, which is going to just necessarily be frustrating, and it's just not useful to your goals, and it's not useful to your mental health either.
The Aussie Fire podcast is a collaboration between Strong Money Australia and Pearler, Australia's favourite boring long-term investing platform. Join our hosts, Dave from Strong Money Australia and Hayden from Pearler, as they discuss all things financial independence. At Aussie Fire, we're big fans of sharing experiences and talking about money. However, please note that any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives. Consider whether it's appropriate for you, and if in doubt, speak to a licensed financial advisor.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Aussie Fire podcast. So in today's episode, we've got a couple of case studies for you. And these two that we've put together, we've kind of put them together because they are similar in a couple of different ways. So they're both listeners in their mid-30s, these two case studies, and they're both currently single, and they're hoping to find partners and have kids within the next 2 to 5 years, I think it is from memory. So they've got somewhat similar circumstances, but they are at different levels of progress as well. And they're heading in the same sort of general direction. So we'll unpack their situations and see what sort of suggestions we can give them on how we might approach similar scenarios. So hopefully that sounds good. Hayden, are you ready to get into it, mate?
Yeah, absolutely. Really keen. I think it's great to hear from, kind of young people in this podcast as well, because, there's obviously quite a lot of opportunity ahead for them. I'll get us started, Dave. I've got the first case study here, first kind of listener background. There's a little bit to unpack here, everyone, so bear with us. This first case study is from Harold, who's 34 years old and they're from Victoria. I'd like to see whether, based on my scenario, building a portfolio of $1 to $1.5 million in today's money by age 50, 15 years from now, is achievable. I'm still deciding whether to spend my retirement years in this beautiful country or return to my country of birth, Colombia. It'll depend on how much my portfolio grows. So that's essentially the question that our listener is trying to tackle. In terms of the background, quoting them again, my salary is $110,000 a year before tax and around $80,000 after tax. I salary sacrifice about $215 per fortnight, which would be about $5,000 a year, into super. I'm able to save around $3,500 per month, or around $40,000 a year, and my plan is to transfer $500 into my savings account and invest $3,000 into shares each month. So most of that money they save every month is going into shares. In terms of expenses and lifestyle, spending around $45,000 to $50,000 overall per year. Harold also says they spend $2,400 per month on rent, groceries, and utilities, and that public transport costs $205 per month, and the phone plan is $14 per month. It's not a ton. For lifestyle and expenses, Harold spends an average of $820 per month, based on a 12-month average from the Frollo app, which includes eating out, entertainment, and other things. Harold doesn't own a vehicle since their work is 10 minutes away by train, but they'll likely need one in the future as they plan to have a child. Harold says, every 2 or 3 years, I plan to travel to Colombia to see family. It's been 2 years since I've done that, so that's why I plan to set aside around $500 each month into the savings account.
So that's like their holiday fund, essentially, that $500 a month. Or their travel fund.
So it looks like $1 out of every $7 is being put towards these trips to Colombia. And then the last things from Harold are that they currently have $100,000 in a portfolio split of 70% VGS and 30% VAS. They have $42,000 in super, and they're a migrant who moved to Australia 6 years ago to start from zero. So Harold thinks they're a bit behind when it comes to super, which makes sense, sure. To help catch up, Harold started salary sacrificing as of last month, which we mentioned before, and recently got citizenship and opened up their Pearler account. Oh, that's very kind of them. That's cool. Last thing is Harold does not own a home and doesn't plan to buy one, at least not before retirement. They have $50,000 in their ING savings account for emergencies, no debt, and just a credit card that gets paid off all the time. So if I loop back to the beginning of that, the question was whether based on those circumstances that it was achievable to build a $1 to $1.5 million portfolio by the age of 50, whether or not, they spend their future in Australia. And the quick recap of those things were pretty average Australian salary, like statistically, expenses around $45,000, $50,000 a year, pretty reasonable. $100,000 in investments, $50,000 in savings. That's basically the situation. So I know we talked about this, Dave, and I know you've got a little bit to unpack. So I'd be interested in kind of hearing your Dave analysis of the whole thing.
Well, it's a pretty good situation to start with, I would say. Like, as you said, the income is pretty decent. They're saving a solid amount and they've started investing, already making pretty good progress on that. So I'd say they should be pretty pleased about what they've achieved so far. The interesting part for me is, I suppose we can unpack this in multiple ways. We can look at the numbers side of things quickly, but then there's also a lot of other sort of intricacies at play here when it comes to their specific situation. So if we just look at the basic numbers, if they're starting with 100 grand and they're investing $3,000 a month, let's say, and they get a 5% real return, so that is after inflation, so that keeps everything in today's dollars for future planning, then in 16 years, they will have over $1 million. I think it's like 1.1 million or something on the numbers that I did there. And if they were to stop salary sacrificing, they would probably give $100,000 or $150,000 more than that. And their super that they have already would probably be about $300,000 by then in today's dollars. So definitely going to put them in the $1.5 million area, let's say. So very achievable. The only thing is there's quite a few, I suppose, not downsides to that, but just things to consider and be mindful of. So the first one that comes to mind is that if they are planning to leave Australia later, or that's a strong possibility, which it might be, when I looked at this, you can't generally take your super with you if you're planning to leave the country and if you're currently a citizen or a resident, let's say, a permanent resident, but you can still access it later as an income stream, from what I understand. So that makes it a little bit trickier to retire on earlier, since the situation was they're hoping to retire at about 50 or so potentially. You could still get the income stream later, but you won't have access to that extra wealth, as soon as your other wealth. So it could potentially not make that much sense to be focusing that much in that area. And I definitely wouldn't be kind of comparing my super to other people's super in that situation in your mid 30s or whatever, because you have completely different scenarios. It just basically makes no sense to be worrying about what your peers have who've maybe lived in Australia their whole lives and who've started work at 20 and they've been collecting super for the last 15 years and it's had time to grow and compound. So I don't really feel that this listener should worry about catching up necessarily. Their situation is entirely different in that realm. So I don't know if you see those things differently, Hayden. But if we're kind of seeing it similarly, then we can move on to the other areas that they have to consider with this case.
I'd probably say I see that pretty similarly. I think overall it's a pretty strong position, which is good. I think, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a second, but it all sounds very achievable, except with this wild card of planning to have a kid part, which I'd be interested in exploring, which I'm sure you're about to talk about as well.
Yeah, no, let's unpack that one, because that could potentially change quite a lot. And it's tricky because when we're dealing with scenarios like this, where there is like a decent time frame is good to have, where you've got 10 or 15 years to plan for, and you've already got all the finances are all lining up really well. It's just the uncertainties of life that could alter dramatically what you need or how that future situation looks. So it is very tricky to kind of give a perfect answer to these things. But yeah, let's unpack the potential partner and kids situation in the future. Let's do that.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think I would broadly say the partner situation is usually a net win. There's a lot of expenses that get reduced in a partner scenario, because especially if you have an extra income coming in, I guess is the short answer there. So I'd say usually my rough estimate, my very rough anecdotal estimate, is that people can, on an individual level, typically improve their actual individual wealth, usually by 10 to 30% if they're in a relationship compared to not. if they're able to actually, have someone else with income in the situation. And that's mostly because of the economies of scale of those things, or even just having two people solving different sets of problems, right? Because there are certain ways, for instance, that I'm sure Dave is very good at saving money or being mindful about money. And there are ways that other people are. And when those two types of people come together, they can save a lot of money. But it's interesting you talk about unexpected expenses, because I feel like that's in essence what I see children as. And again, obviously, I'm always aware that Dave and I are two people sitting here in this podcast without children. But I think just as an example, Dave, my colleague was recently just trying to take like a 1-day trip up to Brisbane to see family, right? And
yeah.
Like on their like first day there, it was an important trip. Their like kid like broke their leg or something. Like it was 6-year-old broke their leg. And they had to jump back on the first plane to come back to Sydney, which is a really interesting idea. And I think some young people I talk to, it's like, they're always like, oh, kids can be cheap and stuff. And I'm like, I agree with that. But also, the tricky part about kids is nearly everyone in my life who would break their leg, I don't need to fly back for, because they're all adults or they're all someone else's kids, if that makes sense. Like I can see them in a couple of days. Let's say maybe it's Friday today and I'm coming home on Sunday. I can come home on Sunday. But if it's like your kid, like they had to fly home straight away because the kid's obviously panicked and stuff. And I think they said that, the Gold Coast to Sydney, which is the cheapest route on average to fly, not Gold Coast, Brisbane, sorry. One of the cheapest, Gold Coast is the cheapest, but Brisbane's one of the cheapest places to get to from Sydney generally. Paid, I think it was like $520 or something one way just to get home, same day. And it's like, you think about that as just as a random example. And that's in the case of the case study, just as an example, that's a bit under a whole week's worth of, wealth progress. So, I mean, that's just me trying to paint the picture visually, I guess, for listeners maybe that haven't had as much exposure with the costs of kids. But kids are a big wild card, particularly not in the guaranteed costs as much as the flexi costs or the sudden costs or things like that.
Yeah, I suppose they just throw in a whole extra bunch of variables that you can't really, you can sort of plan for it, but you can't really predict necessarily what those things are going to be. There's just going to be a whole bunch of ancillary expenses that come with it, just due to the variability of, I don't know, kids and either the things that they get up to or the things that can happen and different things associated with that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to deprive children too, right? Like let's say Dave and I were married with a kid and let's imagine that Dave is really sick in bed or I'm really sick in bed. I'm sure if we were talking to each other, we'd be like, just drink some water, you'll be fine, But, it's like if it's
where's
if
your
it's
sympathy,
our kid,
mate? Come on.
Yeah. Whereas if it's your kid, it's like you're going to really make sure they're okay, and obviously there's lots of people out there who might be more inclined to being less edgy or less anxious about this stuff. But overall, it's still way, way, way easier to just be like, I need to spend money to resolve this situation with this particular individual. So yeah, huge amounts of unknown or surprise expenses. So that's probably the most interesting thing, because this case study for me, when they describe the numbers, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Like on a average Australian salary where you can save a significant chunk of your post-tax income, like around 50%, you can reach $1 million in 10 to 20 years based on market performance, somewhere in that realm, as Dave's pointed out. But yeah, the big unknown expense of trying to have a family within that is always interesting.
I also wouldn't mind circling back to something you said about the singles and couples thing, because I agree with you to a point, but I also have heard from so many different people that they're in a couple situation or a marriage or whatever, and they don't, because you're like painting at this picture on everyone is on like the same side and everyone is on the same sort of wavelength, and one person's going to find savings in this area and the other person's going to do that, and this like perfect teamwork. But I've heard from so many people where it's not like that, and where one spouse is more of a saver and one spouse is more of a spender, and it's more about compromise. I would say that it's like 50-50 from the people that I've heard from and spoken to. So I'm just hesitant on making that assumption.
Yeah, you could say that what I'm referring to is a subset of people who prioritize their own values within that relationship, broadly speaking, right? Like, I don't know any kind of relationship where two people have the same view on spending or not spending, right? There are lots of them out there where people have very polar opposite views on it. But I'm more talking about the cases where I assume that, if someone is listening to this podcast and they're engaged with money, they're broadly going to try and involve themselves with someone in a long-term partnership that's within, a factor of a factor of them too. And if that's not you, that's totally fine. But there are people out there like that. And I think that's probably one thing just worth flagging whilst we do have an audience is like, I definitely have met people that sometimes think, I feel like most people are spenders and I'm not a big spender, and therefore I'm probably not going to find someone like me. So I'll just accept that, I'm going to have to end up with a spender. Which I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's just sometimes you have to look under the hood. Or if I'm totally honest with you too, I think there's a significant number of people out there. Sorry to go on this tangent, Dave, but I think there's a significant number of people out there who want to be more frugal than they are. They just haven't had the push for it, or they're not surrounded by the right people. And sometimes you being involved in their lives or even giving them space for that is a good thing. Like I meet a lot of people that maybe might want to walk from one end of the city to the other instead of getting a bus to save a few dollars, and they like the exercise, but they don't do it because they're mostly hanging around with people who would call them silly names for doing that, or wouldn't be like, wow, that's awesome that you want to do that, And I think there's a lot of people out there that, so I guess the point is, there's definitely relationships where it's just disparate, but I think there's lots of scenarios where it can be good, or you can bring out the best in each other.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So you think that there's quite a few people out there who don't save as much as they would want to save because of the peer pressure associated with spending and living a certain way?
Yeah, I see this all the time with tons of stuff. Like I see it with drinking is a really good example. I don't drink alcohol. I think in my entire life, I probably drank alcohol 9 times. 6 of them were on planes when it was free and I wanted to go to sleep, And
yeah.
I've never paid $1 for alcohol in my life, to be clear, which is awesome. But I meet so many people who I meet them and they're like, oh, are you drinking? And I'm like, no. And they kind of look at me with these longing eyes of like, that sounds nice.
Okay. Yeah.
That sounds hard, and sometimes it's verbal. Sometimes I can just see from their body language. But I think it's like that a lot in life. But yeah, same point. Don't be scared about so let's say the listener's like, oh my God, what if I find a partner, but then I end up spending more money? Main point number one is that's in your control. There's plenty of people that are close enough to your values in any capacity in life that you can find it. And number two, even if someone is halfway there, you'd be amazed how much you can learn from them or they can learn from you in terms of values and systems. And there's always going to be disagreements. Like a lot of the people in my life I've been close to are frugal, but they have nearly universally been the type of people that subscribe to the idea of getting their hourly work rate and then deciding if something's worth their time, which is something I don't subscribe to at all. So, it's never peachy across the board anyway, right? Which is totally fine.
Yeah, okay. So maybe if we don't assume, all right, we won't assume the worst case then. We'll assume that he's able to find a partner who's relatively on the same page, and although there might be a little bit of compromise, that'll be sort of evened out and it'll be a pretty good situation overall. So I suppose then there will be the increase in expenses due to the kids or kid, however many he or they eventually decide to have. So that's going to bump up what is required for their FIRE goal, which makes sense. And then I also think there's another big factor here, which is obviously related to the place of retirement. So I can imagine that if they're going to be potentially retiring in Colombia, you could do that on a lot less than what you could do it in Australia, right?
I'd imagine so. I don't want to assume that because that might just highlight my lack of understanding about different countries. But yeah, I imagine so. I'm just looking up the purchasing power. Do you know about purchasing power parity, Dave?
Yes, somewhat.
Can I tell you what really annoys me? It's like when someone uses the exchange rate to determine how cheap something is.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's like, it drives me up the wall.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, for instance, someone's like I'm looking at this, it's like 1 Colombian peso can get you exactly, I have to do it the other way because it's so much. 1 Australian dollar can get you exactly nearly 2,500 Colombian pesos. And immediately someone's like, wow, that's so cheap.
Do Vietnam. Do Vietnam. I think it's like 20,000. So if you got 50 grand, you're a Vietnamese billionaire.
Yeah, it's 17,000.
Yeah, there you go. So
But yeah, and
it doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah, I see this a lot with Japan because I think in 2024 or something, 4% of Australia went to Japan or something wild, and all these people would be like, with $1 you can get 100 yen. I'm like, I don't give a damn. But anyway, just for the listeners, because this is a useful, interesting thing. When you look at other countries, you want to look at like purchasing power as like one is a really useful metric, which is essentially a way of measuring like how strong is their currency. Which, if you compare that between countries, and this is a very generalist way to look at it, basically allows you to be like, if I moved there, would I suffer or not, right? So it's like for an Australian to move to Switzerland is like a bad move, to broad base it financially. Whereas like a Swiss person moving to Australia is like, they probably can improve the quality of their life with the same, their own currency they have and things like this. So yeah, when it comes to Colombia, I'm in a quick Google. Yeah, it looks like, as you'd kind of probably expect, you can probably take those Australian dollars further there than you can here, which is a good thing. And you're right, Dave, around there is that element of moving. I mean, I don't know, you seem like a real country bumpkin in Australia, but I fully confess to, as a millennial that feels strained by the housing market sometimes, I often think about, wouldn't it be nice just to leave the country one day and not have to figure out how to own 500 square meters in Australia? So that's just a side note. And I see this with young people generally, is like, it actually does seem like a reasonable exit strategy for a lot of younger people because of the fact that financially it's just like, what is the end game in Australia to some extent?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think as you see more people get frustrated by the state of the financial world, I suppose, or how they see their financial future, whether some of it is obviously because things have increased, and some of it is potentially because they've decided that they have to live a certain lifestyle and do the same things as everyone else to kind of fit in and all the rest of it. So that's something else we can unpack, which I don't necessarily describe to that kind of philosophy and think it's kind of arbitrary and a bit silly, to be honest, but it's probably another conversation. But I do think that as you see this increasing frustration among younger people, you probably are going to get those who are like, if I can just keep my lifestyle kind of minimal, instead of saving up and potentially buying a house that's going to kind of tie me down for a long time, just so I can live this kind of nice middle-class life in Australia, I could potentially use that same money and get a whole lot more for those dollars elsewhere in the world. And it also lets me travel and lets me explore new places and lets me kind of live with a bit more freedom and a bit more financial security at the same time, rather than being tied to a job to pay for the house that I'm living in. So I think that you probably are going to get more people subscribing to the, let's say, GeoFire type of strategy, I think.
Never heard of GeoFire before, but that's a cool name for it.
Oh, I'm sure I've seen it called that before. I don't think I just made that up. But it's with geographical arbitrage, right?
I've never seen anyone call that something before. So it's not that I disagree. It's more just like I've never heard someone put a name to it, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, like you kind of see it with like expats, right? Who are living on like a US military pension or like an Aussie pension, go and live in Southeast Asia because it's a lot cheaper if they're living on like a limited income, right? And so they're able to, live decently well without straining themselves too much. So it might be very difficult to do that in Australia if you're of limited means, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And to the point of the study too, I think I hope that is an avenue that they can explore if they feel like they, because having $1.5 million by the age of 50 is great, but it is still tragically not the most comfortable amount if it is city living and you don't have any kind of capital in property. So I think that is a great thing if they also have that avenue to be able to go back to somewhere with family that might be more affordable.
And they did say that they either said or they implied that the decision will be somewhat based on, like, it depends how much the portfolio grows, or essentially how much wealth they have at that point.
I might join them depending on how things go too.
So at least I suppose they're open to options and they can assess which kind of avenue is going to be the best for them to live the lifestyle they want later down the road. So I think if you keep your options open, things are going to work out pretty good. But yeah, if he's able to maintain like a decent savings rate when he does end up with the partner and a kid, and there's he finds someone aligned and same sort of kind of mindset and wanting to build a nice financial future for themselves, then I'm sure that this situation will turn out pretty good.
Definitely. All right, Dave, let's jump on to case study 2 of 2. This one is another 30-year-old, not 30s person, Michael, 36 from Perth, over in Dave's neck of the woods. A lot of big Dave fans out in Perth. Who would have thought, being, given that Dave's from Perth. So Michael, this is from Michael. I'm a long-time listener of the Aussie Fire and Strong Money Australia podcasts. Big Dave fan. The weekly insights keep me focused on where I want to be. I'm a 36-year-old living in the southern suburbs of Perth, single, no dependents. My income with overtime is around $150,000 a year. My current assets are $550K in high interest savings. That's
pretty good.
$50,000 in ETFs, $47,000 in gas exploration stock. I invested $110,000.
Ooh,
very interesting. That's unique. I like unique. $7,000 in Bitcoin, $190,000 in super. Okay, it's a lot of capital. In 2022, I sold my property and have missed out on huge gains since then. Oh no, this is the Perth housing market, right, Dave? How it did nothing till recently, I imagine.
Yeah, pretty much, man. Yep. And now it's gone bananas the last 3 or 4 years.
That sucks. The house was 4x2 with a pool, and I quickly learned I did not care for all the upkeep and cost to maintain it. Estimates suggest the value has increased by $360,000 since I sold it. I'd like to meet someone and hopefully start a family within the next few years, but I also don't want to buy a property as I have no ties to a particular area and would rather be accommodating to a prospective partner. Until then, I'd like to build on what I have in the hope that it will serve me well in the future. A passive income stream with a view to semi-retirement and potentially full retirement is the goal. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm falling behind. My cash is becoming devalued and house prices just keep going up. I'm working extra shifts to keep up, and admittedly, this has become my focus. I feel stressed, frustrated, and sad at the situation. Every fortnight pay, I now invest $2,000 to $3,000 in ETFs. I only started investing at the start of 2025, and I don't touch the cash interest. I probably should feel more fortunate. However, I'm not one to share details about my finances, so I really have no idea how I am doing. I see everyone around me getting a free ride off their house values going up, and yet I feel like I'm getting nowhere, or at least not maximizing my situation. The thought of buying a house doesn't appeal to me, particularly where housing feels overvalued. I almost feel like I'm better off renting, even now as the ship for a house has already sailed. I've recently considered going all in with my cash on 2 ETFs, and when the time comes, selling to either buy a property or pay off a partner's mortgage. I'm determined to keep on investing and don't want to be a slave to a mortgage. I would welcome any suggestions and options, and perhaps where necessary, give me some much needed perspective. Last word of that being perspective, which I think is a great keyword to this, which is that they've obviously described the situation to us and they sound very engaged with their money, which is awesome, but they just don't have a good sense or feeling of how they're going.
There's a lot of, when you listen to that, there's a lot of emotional anguish, I would say, in that case study.
Uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sad because it's someone who is in an arguably very, very good position for someone who is in their mid-30s, right? They have almost, it's not that far off $1 million. And the vast majority of that money's just been saved and invested. It's not no windfalls as such, right?
Yeah, I don't know about you, Dave. I don't have data on this, but anecdotally, I'd put them straight away in the top 25% of
they'd have mid-30s. Yeah. Most people would that much in savings, and he spends roughly $55,000 a year, right, including rent. He's making very good income, doing overtime and that admittedly as well, but obviously saving a lot. So if you save a lot for a decent number of years, you can end up with a ton of money, essentially. Yeah. But I would say, just to piggyback off what you said, man, this guy is doing very, very well. I would say he's way overly focused on the negatives of the situation. Worrying about that. So he made the decision to sell the property because he didn't enjoy owning a property. Okay, so that's fine. That makes sense. It's not for everyone. But then to see the property go up in value now makes him second guess that decision or feel extreme frustration at that decision because he sees other people benefiting from owning the property and getting the capital gain. So there's a lot of different ways that you can unpack that. One of them is that those capital gains don't necessarily help those people become financially free. They still have to pay down the mortgage just after they bought the place. They've still got the mortgage repayments. That hasn't changed. They still need some investments if they want to stop working and live off that. So they're not that much further forward, right? It's kind of like spreadsheet wealth in a sense, because unless they're going to cash out and do something else with it, it's not overly useful. So there's that to consider. And then the other part is you can't have known that that was going to happen. So there's no point like torturing yourself over that decision, because yes, you missed out on the gains, but that was part of the trade-off when you decided to sell and no longer own a home. Obviously, there was a chance that house prices would go up, which is exactly what happens. So you can't, like, it's frustrating, but you can't have the benefits of both, right? So you get to avoid the maintenance, you get to avoid the repayments, and you get to have lower costs of renting. So then you're just going to miss the upside of owning a home, I suppose, and the potential capital gains. But like you pointed to, Hayden, when you were reading it out, there is, if this had happened at almost any other time in the last 15 years, you'd probably be happy at your decision because Perth prices went nowhere for like 10 years, right? So if the situation was different and prices went nowhere, then you would be happy. So the person is just basically experiencing regret because of the price went up, not because it was the wrong decision based on their strategy, because they don't even really want to own a home according to the case study and what they've written. They're not particularly appealed to that at all. They would rather just invest and build sort of passive income and this portfolio, expand that. So like worrying about the house price is just not useful at all. Like it just doesn't make sense. But that's obviously the logical side of it. The emotional side of it is like, oh, I missed out, and other people are getting like free money essentially because they see the prices going up and whatever. But I mean, you're just going to torture yourself to death if you don't let that go, because it's not going to go away, right?
100%. I mean, I agree with you. That's the most stark thing about this particular case study, is that feeling of, missing opportunity. To Michael from Perth, you have a significant amount of capital. Just need to stress that. Like for someone your age to build that capital up by yourself,
that's a lot of money.
Yeah, $200,000 in super, $550,000 in high interest savings. That's, as Dave said, it's nearly $1 million. You will be okay. It's then just shades of which okay are you going to be and what's that going to look like, right? There's a lot of people in this country, and I know a handful of them who they are 20 years older than you with 10, maybe 20% of your capital. Like, what's their plan? So it's good, which is great. Probably the main thing I'd say when looking at it is like, you have a lot of money in cash, and I've had a lot of money in cash for a lot of my late 20s. And when you don't own property and you don't have a lot of money in ETFs, you are putting more money in ETFs, which is good. It can lead you to this feeling like you're not on the gravy train. So just a broad piece of advice is, you're clearly someone who wants to take advantage of opportunity. So keep yourself on the gravy trains where you can. Try and get some of that savings into ETFs maybe a little quicker. I wouldn't necessarily say put it in all at once, because if the ETF market crashed after you've already dealt with this kind of trauma from the housing market, you're going to really punch yourself in the face and beat yourself up more for it, even though it's something you can't control. Yeah. And, markets are high and everyone gets that, and we've talked about it, but, it's fine to trickle it in, like set yourself, let's assume you want to, firstly, that's an important caveat, but, set yourself a goal of like, I'm going to convert 500 of that 550 into ETFs over the next 24 months, and I'm just going to set up some kind of automated thing where, every single week I put in like, $2,000 or whatever $4,000. There's a lot of cash there to invest. But also one other thing, and this is probably just speaking from personal experience as someone who went to like the age of 31 without having an apartment-ish, nearly 31, or I can't remember. But if your plan is eventually, like, here's what I started to reflect on when it came to the stress I experienced watching house prices go up. It upset me as someone who didn't want to own a house, because I knew that eventually I would want to own a house. That was kind of the problem. And if you genuinely never, ever, ever want to own property, then like, don't, as Dave said, like, who gives a damn about what the housing market's doing? I don't want to own crypto. So whenever crypto doubles or goes up to whatever, even as someone who used to own some crypto, I don't give a flying F about the price of crypto, because I have no interest in ever having it. So it's the same with property, but I think a lot of anxiety with property is the fact that you eventually want it, in which case I've nearly probably become a bit of like a proponent for some kind of property if you know you eventually want to own it, just because you're at least in the current of the market to some extent. And I've noticed the feeling I have is like when, I think about how much I want to buy a house one day and I watch house prices go up. And there was this place I went and looked at the other day. I thought it was amazing. It was like 2.2 million price guide. I was like, maybe it'll go for 2.4. I check it on Domain on the weekend. It went for 2.9. And I'm just like, how's this ever going to work? Like it's heart crushing. But because I have an apartment, I at least now have this kind of thing in the back of my head, even though it's a much smaller piece of capital, where I'm like, oh, well, if the housing market's going up, then my apartment's probably at least going up a bit, so I'm getting like pulled up a little bit on average, right? And Dave's probably thinking about these things move at different paces, but I think that's one nice thing about it. So I'd say is if you feel like you're behind and you eventually want to own property and you feel very emotionally strung to it and you can afford some kind of capital to be in property, that's another way to de-risk those feelings of feeling like there's lost opportunity. That's me projecting a lot of my own feelings onto that. But broad story was like just explore property or ETFs if you feel like you're out of the picture a bit.
I do think it makes sense if you're fairly certain. Yeah, if you're fairly certain that you want to own property in the future, it probably does make sense to own it sooner rather than later, just so you're not going to destroy yourself mentally over the price that you could have paid when you look back in 10 years or 15 years or whatever it is, if you decide to wait. And maybe it's not the property that you want to live in the future, the one that you buy. Maybe you buy a rental as like a hedge, right, against the market going crazy or something like that. If you're fairly certain of the city at least you want to live in, that can help, I suppose, protect you from upside risk, let's say.
And that's a trade-off,
so
right?
I do think that makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, for this person, they sound like they are not interested in that despite their recent experience. But having said that, I mean, the suggestion to invest more of the money, I would agree with that in most cases, or in almost all cases actually. But with this particular one, it sounds like they want to be, well, two things. Firstly, they want to be in a position where they can offload or sell that portfolio in the future. Let's say if they put it all in now, they want to sell a big chunk in the future to either help pay for the house that they'll get in the future or pay off their partner's mortgage if their partner already has a house. So that's one thing. If their partner doesn't have a house, there's a very strong chance that they want to own a house if they're just like a normal person, right? So the money's going to come out. And if he's going to potentially have a partner and be having kids in the next 5 years, there's a very strong chance that happens in the next 5 years because most people like to buy a house and then have kids and do all that sort of thing at the same time. So that means your time frame is pretty short. It's like 3 to 5 years. So in that case, I wouldn't want to have the vast majority of that capital in the market for 3 to 5 years because there is not a small chance that something bad happens and there is less money than what you put in. It's just a risk to be mindful of. And I personally probably wouldn't feel comfortable putting it all in if I knew it was going to come out in 4 years' time or something like that. So you could drip feed some of it in, as Hayden's saying, but maybe not all of it, and maybe keep like a nice big deposit for the house or something like that. So then you're at least benefiting from the upside of growing assets and getting higher returns most likely than what you're getting in cash. And then you're kind of benefiting from that while also keeping cash for the future property, whether it's deposit or paying it off or whatever. Or if you're okay with having a bigger mortgage later, then it could make sense to invest all of it and then just kind of use the investment income to help you pay the mortgage. But this person also said that they're a little bit worried about being a mortgage slave, as they put it. So that kind of implies that they probably want to have a lower level of debt. They don't really want a big mortgage. So I'm going to guess that they would rather go with the smaller mortgage option and use a bigger deposit, something like that. That's kind of what I'm seeing between the lines, let's say.
Yeah, I think you're right about a lot of that stuff, Dave, particularly around like the whole like don't put the big chunk of cash in the market if you intend to use it soon is good advice. The two nuances I'd probably add there are like there's a difference between needing to use it soon and hoping to use it soon, in terms of like, I have a lot of money in the market that I hope to use in the next 3 to 5 years for a house deposit, but I don't need to. As in, it's not like do or die. Like if it takes 8, I'm going to be like, okay, whatever, that's just life. And if you are in that hope, not need stage, then you can be a bit more like, let's just see how the market goes. But if you are in the like, this is a really big deal to me, this time frame, then yeah, you can't risk it. The other thing I'd say is just, and this is just my approach to stuff, is if I'm more anxious about putting money into investments from cash, usually what I try and do is not necessarily have a bigger buffer. I just expand my time frame out longer. Is I just say my plan is to invest this in ETFs over 7 years instead of 2 or something like that, which is kind of completely arbitrary, but that's just kind of how my head for God knows what reason. Because at least I think in that way, I feel like I have a plan to invest most of it. So I feel like I've committed to growth in a way. Like I've committed to being like, I want to build my wealth and I want to de-risk it over time. Whereas when I kind of get in this headspace of like, I want to keep 200 grand there, then if the market goes up, I feel like I like kind of made a bad decision because I committed to not wanting to invest that money. And therefore it's like, oh, am I not doing enough with my cash or something like that? Probably just the last point I'd add is around the partner house thing. It makes sense, right? Like I've seen a lot of, not a problem I've run into in my life, I guess, but I've seen a lot of friends who like, they meet someone and then they couple up and then they're both like, I have a property. They're like, what do we do with all our properties? 2 comments I make on that, well, maybe a few. Number 1, optimize for yourself first is just my personal advice to anyone I meet. It's so easy to kind of overthink optimizing a very speculative thing. It's like what's guaranteed is you're going to have to live your life one way or another. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the hypotheticals because it's better downside protection. But again, that's just my view. Secondly, if you do meet someone and you both happen to have property, I don't think you're both going to spend a lot of time sitting around being like, stupid, wasteful. Like you're just going to be like, cool, we own more capital. Maybe that wasn't the absolute best allocation of capital, but we have more things to play with or more decisions to make or, more optionality or something like that. So I think it can be really easy to kind of demonize that option. But yeah, I haven't come across a lot of people anecdotally who have been like, damn, if only I knew that I'd fall in love with you. Shouldn't have had this capital. Should have had it in cash or something like that. I haven't come across a lot of that, but it's very possible. I'm not kind of being firm as like, definitely ignore that problem. It's just, I feel like for most people, that is probably an overstated concern given how speculative it is.
Yeah, they're going to have to decide on a strategy for that cash, I think, that in a way that they're comfortable, because probably they're feeling frustration at seeing things go up, property and the share market most likely. So I think if they can figure something out in a way that they're happy with the amount of risk that they're taking and also happy with the amount of progress that they're making, then that'll kind of mesh those 2 things together and they'll be a lot more calmer about the trajectory that they're on. And I do think you make a good point there, Hayden, about not overthinking what might happen in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of, well, what if my partner has a house, or what if they want to buy in 3 to 4 years and it has to be a certain amount, or it has to be a certain, gonna need this money to, take out of the market to do things. So I do think that makes sense. You definitely want to be in a position of being flexible to where you don't need to take the money out. But I suppose the risk there is they will feel like they need to take it out because they'll feel like, okay, we're going to have a kid. We need a house. My partner doesn't have a house, so let's get one. And so then they're going to feel like that they do need to take it out. So it's tricky, man. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, but there's shades of it too. And I don't want to send us on a tangent, but I got a text from a friend last night who basically said that he thinks both him and his partner are going to get made redundant in the next 2 weeks, separate companies.
Wow.
Bit of a, tricky situation. And
wow, both within 2 weeks, Jesus.
Yeah. But they basically have a, not to throw more numbers at people, but they basically have an $800,000 mortgage and they have $400,000 in offset and $400,000 in ETFs. And they were kind of sitting around asking me like, should we sell the ETFs? Like, life's really scary. Should we just offset everything? I don't want to play around in the market. And that's a whole question in and of itself that we could explore, I'm sure, in another episode. But the point I want to get at is like their way of thinking with stuff was also very binary. And it's so easy to do this with money. It's like, should I put all the ETFs in offset or should I keep it? And it's like nothing stops you from doing half, or there's nothing that says like there are scenarios where you can't do both. So just as this example, let's imagine that this person takes $500,000 and puts it in ETFs over a couple of years. And let's imagine the market doesn't perform as well. Okay, well, let's say they need a house deposit. No one's saying that you need to access all of that capital at once, which means that it's not all that capital necessarily that's at risk. Let's imagine that the market's down because of another Trump tariff thing, but you only need to access maybe 40% of your portfolio for a deposit. That's great because you can access the rest of your portfolio slowly as the repayments need to be made, in which case maybe the market can bounce back in that time, And I know that sounds like a little bit of a, specky answer, but it's so easy to think of these things in these really binary ways. But reality is when financial decisions actually pan out, there's often quite a lot of optionality and time that can pass between things, like even as an example, it's like there's someone out there who had an ETF portfolio during March or April of 2025, was about to put a deposit, put the deposit down on the house. Yeah. And then, Trump did the tariff thing and their portfolio went down 15% and they pulled their hair out, they signed their contract. And then over the next weeks towards settlement, the market bounced back up, just before they'd settled the house and things like this, right? And obviously there's the other case where someone was just about to settle and the market crashed. But there's just so much there's so much nuance to how all these things play out that it's more often than not less bad than our heads make us feel like it will be.
Yeah, I think less bad than you think is probably a great way to summarize this guy's situation. He seems to have a very, he's struggling to comprehend just how good his situation is. I think it's a very strong situation because I just did a couple of quick numbers, and if he was to invest the cash that he has and then just add the monthly surplus that he currently has, in 5 years from now, he'd have $1.2 million in that portfolio. And in 10 years from now, he'd have $2 million in that portfolio. And that's inflation adjusted as well. So, I mean, that's pretty much going to be enough for full financial independence in 10 years' time, assuming you're not spending massively more than you are now, even accounting for inflation. Or he could essentially semi-retire now, I would say, based on his current spending if his money was invested, because he's not spending that much, right? So, and he's earning a good income. So I think he's got a lot more options and a lot more financial wiggle room in that than he realizes.
Just to wrap up this whole conversation, Dave, I'll tell you a quick funny story, because this listener who asked the question and said it was really sad to see their house go up 360 grand that they had. Whenever I had been looking at houses, just to kind of to tease it out, I have this thing in my head, which is that I nearly can't bring myself to ever consider a house that the price since the person bought it has gone up enough to pay them the average Australian salary, if that makes sense. Let's say it's 500K, dude, and then it's Yeah. I told someone this last night and they gave me shit for it. But let's say they bought a house in 2005 that was 300 grand and now it's 2.3. And if you average that out across the years, it basically is the equivalent of earning 150 grand tax free. I just feel so sad about that scenario that I'm like, oh.
This is the most arbitrary shit I've ever heard.
That's the exact word my friend used, and they were equally as blunt to me about it.
That's so funny.
But yeah, I mean, it is completely dumb and arbitrary. I wouldn't hide from that fact. But my point is, I understand the feeling. I am a 32-year-old, younger and millennial that has been out of the property market until 2024. So it hurts. It hurts to not be in it, to not be benefiting from it, and to just watch people benefit from it in the most arguably hilarious quantums, absurd mathematics of it sometimes.
Do you think part of that is actually your brain equating that growth with sort of a level of unsustainable return? So somewhere in your subconscious, you're like, if it's had that much growth over this 10 or 20 year period, then that's obviously not a good place to park my capital because it's probably going to have a period of underperformance, or it just feels like it's just too expensive.
No,
it's not a great financial decision. Is there something to
rational.
that, or do you think it's just something you made up?
No, it's my lizard brain. It's my lizard brain 100%. I had two parents who worked very hard. You know, for a lot of my teenage years, I was sorting out my own dinner and my sister's dinner and getting us. We woke up and the house was empty and we got ourselves to school, and they worked very, very hard. And I can't say a lot of good things came from it, even though you could argue they're deserving of it. If you assume that hard work should mean, you know, success, which is a topic in and of itself. But it just hurts me to think of these people who just bought someplace and just sat there for a decade.
Okay.
And now they can do whatever they want.
So it's the unearned gains of it. Is that what it is that kind of bothers you in your core a little bit?
Yeah, and I don't want to say that it's all unearned, because obviously, like, they have to take on debt, they have to have security, they often have to have upkeep and all of that. But it's more like there's a point where it's just insane. That's the crazy part. Like, that's why I say it's when it's above the average salary. I'm just like, what? Sorry, you're telling me that, like, you could have basically just like lived off, you know, some free loan from someone else for 15 years and then sold your house and netted it all off and done nothing for a decade and a half. This is just wild, you know? So I'm happy that people get to make money off capital, but some of the stuff we see in housing in Australia just stings because it's just the numbers. Like, I live about a 10-minute drive from Strathfield here, and I see like plots of land going in Strathfield, like 600 square meters for like $5 or $6 million. And you're just like, this doesn't.
Wow.
It's just... it's probably a very Sydney topic, to be fair, but it's not right. That's the problem. Gives me the heebie-jeebies. Anyway, that's just a tangent. Again, trying to think of the listener and be like, it is just painful sometimes, and nothing can change the fact that it's not just unsettling to watch those things happen when you're not part of it.
There's just one other thing that I wanted to mention here. They did mention that they've been doing a lot of overtime in a bid to keep up with, I suppose they perceive themselves as falling behind. So they've been working a lot extra to kind of keep up with this.
Sounds like you do.
I suppose arbitrary benchmark that they've created in their mind of where they're supposed to be at this age, or keep up with the sort of effortless maybe house price gains that their peers or friends have earned. So it doesn't sound like this person is in the happiest state. And I do think potentially working so much and agonizing so much is probably being a detriment at this point to their life, because they're probably working too hard to the point that they're unable to see anything outside of the downsides, right? You know, when you get to a point and you're like, maybe you're like tired and grumpy and you just see like negative everywhere. You're just like frustrated by a lot of things. Your mind can't really function properly and gain proper perspective because you're not taking time out or living a healthy enough life, and you're not like, do you know what I mean? You know what I'm getting at? There's like some sort of a qualitative factor here that I think is at play.
I know what you're getting at about, is the overtime hurting, particularly like, you know, mental health and stuff. I'm a terrible person in that I don't know if I've ever turned down many opportunities to make another dollar. My entire life has been overtime for like pretty much since I was 20, in the sense that like beyond unavoidable breaks, I don't know the last time whether it was for money or not money or more money that I haven't worked for more than 40 hours a week. So I'm a bad person to like listen to on this topic. But what I would say is what's important is if you are pushing yourself, and I push myself, know very, very clearly, even to the point of economizing the hell out of it, why you're doing it. Like, if you aren't looking at the overtime and being like, because of this overtime, I will get X, you know, even if it's speculation. You know, the overtime gives you an extra 20 grand a year. Okay, what's that after tax? Okay, what's that invested? Okay, what's that compounded? Okay, what's the passive income of that? Okay, well, because of this overtime I'm doing for the next 10 years, I'll be able to live this lifestyle that I'm not otherwise living, or I'll be able to retire this much earlier than otherwise. Because if you don't have that in your head, if you have that in your head, I think for a typical person, it's actually an incredible driving force. And if you don't have that in your head, or it's not possible, then you'll be miserable. And also you might just discover the math doesn't check out. Like I took on this extra work this year. It was worth about $4,000 over about 3 months. And I think I regret it, to be honest, Dave, because like it's the first time I think I've regretted doing extra work, because really tired at the moment. I have other things to do. I have a lot of work to do with my company, of 7 years, naturally. And it takes up like a few hours a week. And I look at the math and I'm like, $4,000 I go after tax. What's that? 2,800 or something. What in God's name am I going to do with that over a 40-year period at this point? And that's probably what you're getting at, in the sense that like that little snippet of, call it overtime, that I'm doing just is probably hurting more than it's helping. And even when I economize it, I'm like,
yeah, I think it's context based, right? So in your context, it probably doesn't make that much sense. In a person who's starting out and they're only 1, 2, 3, 5 years into their journey and they're still kind of trying to build their base, then it makes a lot of sense. And like you said, especially if they're a sort of numerically minded person, if they can focus on the metrics, like, okay, if I do this work, I get this much and I can invest it. And then what does that mean for my future and my FI date and all the rest of it? That can be extremely motivating. I did that. Like I spent years focusing on that sort of stuff. So I think that makes perfect sense. But when you get to a point where you've got a really good base, like this guy does, and then you're not so much doing it for your own metrics and your own progress. You're doing it because he's looking around at other people and worrying that they're ahead of him or that he's falling behind. That's when it gets unhealthy, because then you're putting in all this work and effort towards something that you can't necessarily control, which is an external factor, which is going to just necessarily be frustrating. And it's just not useful to your goals, and it's not useful to your mental health either.
Exactly. And the problem with this kind of stuff is that for a lot of us, our salaries don't increase maybe as fast as our wealth compounds over time too. And what I mean by that, and this is just saying Dave's point another way, is that, let's take Michael earning this $150,000. The value of each dollar for Michael is less now on an income basis than it was 3 years ago, right? Is another way to think about what Dave's saying. The same thing, $4,000 means less to me now than it did 8 years ago when I started trying to save a lot of money, because the percentage improvement in your overall wealth position that each dollar gets you naturally is lower as your wealth grows. And that can be something you have to really look at as you get fatigued. And some people listening in this podcast have been grinding for a lot of years and know what we're talking about. Some people are quite early in the journey and like would take everything they get. But, the most important thing is, at the end of the day, everyone's doing this stuff to be happy over the long term. And you just need to make sure that you're not kind of killing yourself in the present for it, to the end where you're feeling really crappy.
Yeah, it just makes absolutely no sense, I think, to do anything based on what your peers are doing or how society measures your own, situation. Just you need to focus on your own path and your own progress and the things that you can control. And it doesn't matter what happens with somebody else's situation, if they get a massive inheritance or they get an easy ride off some big house price growth that may not continue. You can't control those things. All you can do is focus on your own position and improving your own position, which you have been doing, and it's clearly working. So keep doing what you're doing and try not to let the other things kind of bog you down mentally.
100%. And last thing for me, because Dave and I have dragged this one out a little bit, if you're ever feeling the peer pressure of things, which everyone feels at some point, just go look at some data is my advice. And I found this to be extremely useful. Like really, really common pieces of data that are good to look at is like average super balances based on ages. One of my favorite one is household savings rate. Just go look up household savings rate. Like I've looked at this right now. And if you exclude COVID, where things got a little bit weird, the average household savings rate right now, just looking at a couple of links I found online, has been pretty steady at around 3 to 5% in 2025. 3 to 5%. So like you think about it, if you're doing $150,000 a year, let's call it 100,000 after tax, is probably marginally more than that. That means the average Australian of that 100,000 average household is only managing to save 4 to 5 grand of that, and like put your position in that context, because the problem is that a lot of the Australians that are struggling are completely out of the spotlight. They're not the ones on the 7 o'clock news turning up to the auction of the new place that just went for a lot of money, or they're not the ones in the property market. They're not the ones that are, running these podcasts and things like that. And that's not saying that's a annoying thing, because we just don't see how many normal people out there are not in good capital positions. And it's so easy to beat yourself up when you just look at the sliver of people who are like really outperforming the median. Kind of a sad topic, but nonetheless.
That's a really good message, man. No, 100%. Totally agree with that, because it's easy to say don't focus on your own path, whatever, and it's basically cliche advice at this point. So there's obviously some like knee-jerk pushback when someone says that. It's like, yeah, easy to say, not so easy to do, because humans are kind of like comparison machines, right? So in some ways, you're always going to be curious about how other people are doing. So in that case, if you feel the need to compare, don't compare to the 1, 3, 5, 7, 10% of people who are in better positions than you. Focus on the 90% of people who are in worse positions than you, and gain a better perspective and some appreciation for how good your situation really is. And it's not just like luck, obviously, it's due to your own actions as well in a lot of cases, especially in this particular case. So if you are going to do it, try and do it in that sort of a way, in a more healthy way. And then that's obviously people within Australia too. And then you could consider the average person around the world, who is obviously going to be in an average position that is worse than the people in Australia, right? Because Australia is one of the more prosperous countries in the world. So you could do it that way as well. And you're probably then in the 1 or 2% of global citizens, let's say. So your life experience and your financial flexibility and position and options in life is way, way better than the vast majority of humans in the world.
Well, I think we can wrap it up there, Dave. I think there have been 2 really interesting case studies. Like what happens with many of these case studies, it is often cases of listeners reaching out, feeling uncertain about their path, but they have more options a lot of the time, or are in a better position than they might otherwise realize. So probably just a big shout out to all of our listeners is, if you're out there saving capital and you have, tens of thousands of dollars somewhere, you're on a good path, particularly if you're under the age of 50. So just keep it up. Don't beat yourself up too much, and keep your head down. Stay healthy, keep your head down, and a lot of good things will happen from that. So really appreciate the people who share these things as well. It's obviously a lot to share out on the internet. So hopefully they benefited from it if they're listening, and anyone else listening, we'd also love to hear if you benefited from it too. So feel free to leave a comment, like the podcast, share the podcast. If you want to ask your own question, you can actually follow a link in the show notes. If you want to submit a more detailed case study with kind of an associated question about your situation, you can also follow a slightly different link in the show notes. Otherwise, you can reach out to us at hello@aussiefirepod.com if you don't have anything you want to kind of have appear on the podcast. Or if you want to reach out to us on socials, you can reach out to myself at Perla or Dave at Strong Money Australia, at any kind of social media out there that exists. Otherwise, thank you everyone for listening. Thanks for tuning into this long episode if you've made it this far, and we'll catch you around to the next one.
See you guys.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Aussie Fire. For more FI inspiration, head to perla.com to browse our resources, calculators, and community insights. Perla is an authorized representative number 1281540 of Sandland Private Wealth Pty Ltd with AFSL number 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when investing. So always seek advice and/or check out the relevant disclosure document for any financial product, including the PDS and TMD before deciding. These are available from the product issuer's website. When you invest, your capital is at risk, and past performance is not a reliable indicator of future investment returns.